With the One X2, Insta360 seemed to have struck the perfect balance between size, cost and performance. But there's always room for improvement, and with the X3, Insta360 have brought a raft of improvements to the table. Have these upgrades been enough to knock the venerable One X2 from the top spot? Keep watching and we'll soon find out. Keeping the same basic form factor, the X3, now without the One, has two slightly larger 48-megapixel half-inch sensors and slightly larger lenses to go with them. But the biggest and immediately noticeable upgrade is the glorious, great big tempered glass touchscreen, underneath which nestles a new lens switching button right next to the record button. There's also a redesigned microphone, a real door for the USB-C port, and an increased capacity 1800 mAh battery. The charging port door is a welcome improvement over the flappy panel thing. On the other side, there's another microphone, speaker port, power button, and a brand new quick mode change button. With a single push of the power button and a little bit of patience, that delicious screen springs to life. Using the screen itself is a pleasure. It's responsive, it's quick, and you can do the kind of framing that before you'd need to use the app for. Looking through your recorded footage is slick, and panning around inside 360 videos to check and see how good the shot was is a delight. The X3 has a raft of 360 modes, including time-lapse, time shift, bullet time, loop recording, star lapse, burst photos, interval photos, HDR photo, standard photo, video and active HDR. And then in the single lens mode you can choose video, photo, loop recording and the brand new Me mode. The new lens switching button allows you to quickly switch from 360 mode to single lens mode using the inner lens, single lens mode using the outer lens and back to 360 mode again. You can't, however, switch lenses while you're recording. The new Quick Change button on the side of the camera lets you quickly switch between a set of customizable frequently used mode presets without having to go into the menus and change the settings manually every time. There is, however, no way to select a mode with the button, and you have to tap it on the screen, which kind of makes the cycling function of the button a bit redundant. In 360 mode, the X3 will shoot in 4K at 60 or 30 frames per second, sadly no 50, 25 or 24 FPS options, and in 5.7K at 30, 25 and 24 frames per second. In the settings, you have buckets of control at your fingertips, should you want it, and you can control the white balance, set the ISO value, and a nice feature I think is the ability to set an ISO max, so that the ISO will never go above this level, keeping unwanted grain in check. A little frustratingly, you're chucked out of the settings every time you select something, but you can also control the shutter speed, chucked out again. You can choose a color profile from standard, log or vivid, and finally there's an option for isolated exposure, but I didn't really mess with that at all. Right, that's enough about the settings and features. Let's see what this camera can do. Now, for those of you that don't know already, the X3 is essentially two cameras back to back. One records the view to the left, one records the view to the right, and then software stitches those two views together to create this incredible floating selfie drone effect, all with Insta360's astonishingly good flow state stabilization. This is possible because the clever stitching also completely eliminates the selfie stick from the view. The footage is then taken into the Studio app, and an equirectangular video like this is created. Within this view, you can then choose exactly where you want the camera to look, and using fully adjustable keyframes as well as field of view presets, quickly create pans, zooms, and other swoopy film terminology that you can then export to the cinematic masterpieces that you could never create with an ordinary action camera.
Maybe someday when I've grown older, I can see it all clear from above, looking back on it all. Maybe I can see what was broken. Ooh, but it's a lonely calling. Yeah, it's a lonely calling.
The sickness-inducing spins and turns that you can create are limited only by your imagination. Being able to point the camera long after you've finished recording means that you can capture all of the things that you may have missed or just wouldn't have been fast enough to frame with a conventional camera. Which means you can forget about where the camera is pointing while you're recording and leave the directing until you get home. You can also use features like speed ramping, motion blur, and direction lock to create cool effects like this one, where it looks like we're following the Majorcan sun down the mountain ridge. Or like this one, where it seems like no matter how hard we try to get away, that mountain is chasing us up the hill. Insta360 tells us that the larger sensor of the X3 means better performance in low light. So here, looking into the shade under the trees, I would say that their claims are pretty accurate, made more impressive by the pins of sunshine flashing through every now and then, but not blowing out the exposure. Getting towards the golden hour here, the X3 creates a really nice picture, and I'm happy to see that rather than maxing the ISO and creating gain, the camera is slowing the shutter speed and creating the really nice motion blur on the rock face while simultaneously doing a great job of keeping the exposure in check during constantly changing lighting. Darker still now, you can see the headlights on the rocks, and although the grain is definitely increased, the video itself is very watchable and given the incredibly difficult circumstances with the bright sky, pretty well exposed. About as dark as it gets now, and despite us needing the headlights to see the road, the X3 is doing a bang-up job of creating a balanced, if somewhat grainy exposure, and a decent picture where you can astonishingly still see details under the olive trees to the left. And of course, low light testing wouldn't be complete without a run through a tunnel. Sorry, no rev bombs from the hired hybrid car, but once again, the X3 has captured a really watchable and most importantly usable video. Most impressive is that the stabilization isn't a mess of jitters and mush in these challenging low light conditions. Well, that's enough of standard video, let's move on to the new Active HDR mode. Active HDR creates a hybrid image for multiple exposures and allows the camera to display more dynamic range, maintaining detail in the shadows while preventing blown out highlights. So here, where the sky would normally be a ceiling of white, we can still see the clouds right next to the sun, while simultaneously still being able to see the details on the wall that would normally be completely in shadow. And here, despite the sun low in the sky, we can still see the clouds, as well as details on the dark side of the mountain over in the distance, and pieces of grass in the shadow of the little wall by the road. In this tough example, with an almost complete 360-degree bend under the bright sun, exposure stays almost constant throughout, with none of the highlights or details in the shadows being lost. In particular, despite the sun immediately behind it, we can impressively still see brickwork under the bridge. But as the view sweeps round, we can see one of the first small chinks in Active HDR's armour. There were a few cases where, like here, the camera couldn't seem to decide exactly how to expose the shot, and it also couldn't decide which details to keep and which to lose. Watch as the trees on the hillside to the right flicker from bright to dark and sharp to soft. And also like here, sometimes the Active HDR struggled with clear blue skies and caused this flickering effect with pronounced gradients between the shades of blue. The second downfall is the stitch line. You can clearly see it in the middle of the screen here, and although the details are stitched perfectly as the camera sweeps over the parked cars, the colours aren't. I do want to say again though, just how impressive that stabilisation is. But yeah, the stitch line here is with the chromatic calibration turned on in the app. To put that into context though, here's the same shot with the chromatic calibration turned off, just to show you how much work the software is already doing. So hopefully this can maybe be improved in future with software and firmware updates. Next up is 4K 360, which now allows us to shoot at 60 FPS. This mode gives us the ability to slow the video down by half, slightly more if you work in 25 FPS like me, and using speed ramping, highlight the important parts of the video. Against 5.7K, we've naturally lost a bit of the detail, but in certain use cases, I think that the effect created makes the slight loss of detail worth it. Next on the agenda is single lens mode. With this mode, you can use the camera like an ordinary action cam, demonstrated by our beautiful assistant here on a chest mount, and use either one of the lenses to create a wide-angle stabilized video, either in 9x16 for your socials or in conventional 16:9 widescreen. You can select a field of view option from Ultra, Action, Wide, or Linear. Or you can use Pro mode, which creates a circular video which you can then feed into the Studio app. Then you can turn stabilization on or off and retrospectively choose the field of view that best suits the shot, as well as being able to actually adjust the angle. The outputted video in Pro mode is limited to 2.7K though, so when compared to the 4K basic mode video, that control comes at the cost of a bit of detail. There is also a 3.6K 60 FPS option, which again allows you to slow the video down. But this option doesn't have horizon leveling, so to obtain that effect, you have to use the Pro mode and again take a slight hit on the resolution. Bullet time is nothing new to Insta360, but the X3 has been up to 4K at 120 FPS, so higher resolution and slower slow-mo allow you to create cool shots like this. Catalog pose 1, go! Starlapse is a feature that I didn't play with much, but on my first and only go, I managed to create these shots using the mobile app, so I think it's something worth spending some time to perfect. Sadly, I didn't get to try out things like time-lapse, time shift, loop recording, or any of the photo modes, but there are lots of very exciting reviewers here on YouTube who I'm sure will be more than happy to oblige.
Now, whatever you do with your 360 camera, there's almost certainly going to come a time when you're going to want to hold the thing in your hands and talk to the camera about the incredibly interesting things you're doing, like taking a stroll on this beautiful crisp wintry morning. And so, to give you an idea of how that works and how the built-in mics of the camera work, I've got the selfie stick extended about halfway, just holding it at waist height so the camera's level with my head. It's about 50 centimeters away from me, and I've currently got the microphone set onto the wind reduction setting. Possibly a little bit of overkill because there really isn't very much wind at all today, it's just freezing cold. So there you go, that's the wind reduction setting on the X3 with me blathering inanely at the camera about nothing. Thought I was about to be run down by a Dalek. Right then, so here we are again, same crisp morning, same inane blathering chat, but this time the microphones are set onto the stereo setting. Means there's zero wind reduction happening, but obviously hopefully on a day like today that won't really be that much of an issue. Although stereo is a bit of an interesting concept because apparently the camera actually has 4 microphones, but it's neither here nor there. But yeah, that's the X3 on the stereo setting, once again about 50 to 70 centimeters away from my face, and yeah, just the sound of my voice with whatever nature sounds are in the background as well. So now, you guessed it, same situation. This time the microphones are set onto the directional focus setting. So hopefully with me talking to the camera and with you looking directly at me, you should be hearing me as clear as possible using a combination of all 4 of the microphones around the camera. So I would hope that if the programming is working and the technology is working, that this will sound the best because it will be taking all of the microphones and getting the best sound possible out of my mouth into the camera. Sometimes the internal mics, they're just not going to be good enough. Maybe there's too much wind. Maybe, as now, you want to have the camera a bit further away from me. I've now got the selfie stick about 3/4 extended, basically because of the length of my microphone cable. And I've actually got the Insta360 microphone and power adapter plugged into the side of the X3, connected up to my lapel mic from my Zoom F2 audio recorder, and that is now recording the audio into the camera from the microphone on my collar here, which obviously means, thanks to the great big dead cat muff thing on it, that the wind's going to be reduced. And also I've got a lot more control now with regards to volume, because I can actually change the setting of the gain inside the camera from 0 to +6 down to -6 dB. And obviously that gives you the ability to fine-tune to your equipment, because all microphones are different. Some are really sensitive, some are really insensitive, some are just downright rude. But what happens when a cable just isn't good enough? What happens when you want to have the selfie stick extended fully and you just haven't got a wire long enough to reach between you and the camera? Well, you can actually connect using Bluetooth a set of Apple AirPods to the camera, and then the audio from the microphones in the AirPods is transmitted into the camera and used instead of the onboard mics. I don't actually have a set of AirPods. I know this is a stupid thing to say because I've got a set of AirPods in my ears. I actually just robbed these from my missus for the test. But what does that mean if you don't have a set of AirPods? Have Insta360 basically just excluded everybody who isn't an app like us lot? Well, actually no, because although it says AirPods in the menu, which is deeply misleading, you can actually connect other Bluetooth devices to the camera and use them as a microphone instead. I've currently got a set of Jabra Bluetooth headphones plugged in, and they seem to work too. Obviously your mileage may vary in terms of the quality of the recording, depends a lot on the programming of the headphones, the microphones built in, wind reduction, all that kind of stuff. And also, it seems that not all devices can actually connect. I was really happy to see, thanks to Filtonic, that on the X2, I was actually able to connect my Cardo intercom to the unit and use that as a microphone to record for the audio, which is great for the motorvlogging thing. Sadly, I found with the X3, though, that none of the intercoms will connect to it. It just doesn't want to register it as a device, and I can't use the microphones in those for my motorvlogging, so that's a bit of a shame.
While we're at it, here's a test of the audio using the X3 with it on directional focus mode. So you get an idea of how the sound will sound.
Entering average speed check zone.
Yes, thank you, Mabel. So you can hear how the sound will sound through the built-in microphone in the cabin of the Mercedes Sprinter as I cruise my merry way down to the French Riviera.
Exiting average speed enforcement zone.
Do you mind? I'm busy, love. This time with the microphone set on stereo, which potentially might have a more balanced sound, as before it would have been concentrating primarily on the camera, either on the front or the rear. Not entirely sure which that is just yet. I'm glad you asked, Andrew. Well, directional focus actually works by using the sound from all 4 microphones, and then based upon where the view looks in the app afterwards, when you reframe the video, the sound is loudest from the direction that you're looking in. So right now the view's looking at me, hopefully the sound of my voice is nice and loud, but if we were to spin the view around so it looks down the path away from me, hopefully, if the thing is working, then the sound of my voice would actually become much quieter, because the view is actually looking away from me and it's creating a realistic feeling of watching that video, and the sound's changing as the view moves around. You need to bear this in mind, of course, if you use the directional focus and you have somebody talking like me now, for instance, and I pan the camera away from myself, the sound is obviously going to get quieter, so that's not necessarily what you want. Maybe stereo or wind reduction would be the better choice, because then as the view pans back round to me, the sound of my voice should now get louder again. And that is how directional focus works. Thank you for clearing that up, Andrew. Still clipping along at 130 kilometers an hour on the French motorways, on the way down to the French Riviera. It's a hard life, please don't hate me. I do have to work when I get there. And then finally, we come to the new Me mode. Me mode is limited to 1080 resolution, but you can choose from 60 or 30 FPS, portrait or widescreen aspect ratios, as well as Ultra Plus, Wide Plus, Linear Plus, or Max View field of view options. Unfortunately, I placed a little too much faith in the AirPods feature here, and I'm afraid the audio isn't exactly stellar, so sorry about that. And what this basically does is it creates a video for you where the view is always looking at you. But it comes with a couple of caveats, mainly that I'm holding the selfie stick here. You can see that the center of the selfie stick is where my hand is. I mean, you can't see the selfie stick because of the magical disappearing selfie stick trick. The selfie stick basically creates the center of the frame. So wherever the selfie stick is pointing, that's where the view is going to be pointing, which means if I point the camera over that way, the center of the view is now over there in the lake. And with this in mind, it means you can do all sorts of stuff. You can have the camera behind your head. You can swing it behind you, following you along as you walk through the trails. You can even swing it around kind of faux bullet time style. But as I'm in quite a shady area right now, as you can see, the light of the sun behind me is just dipping below the trees there. I've actually got it in the lower of the 2 settings available for this in terms of frame rate, which is 30 frames per second. Yeah, this is the Me mode in 30 frames per second, which unfortunately is going to look a little bit odd because I've shot everything else for this entire review in 25 frames per second, so there's going to be a few drop frames in there. Don't blame that on the camera, although it kind of is the camera's fault because it doesn't have 25 frames per second. There you go. Now we're on the other side of the lake. Everything is a bit more open, a bit brighter, so I've got the camera set into 60 frames per second. Now, for both of these settings, in fact, for all of the settings in the Me mode, you're limited to 1080p for the resolution. And for both of these, incidentally, I've been using AirPods again while I've robbed them from the wife. I might as well get the most use out of them, but there we go. The 60 frames per second stuff, you can probably do crazy shit like toss the camera in the air, drop it down to slow motion, makes it look really cool. There's maybe some crazy effects like but I haven't said that. I remember that the stitching doesn't work very well. underwater. And while we're on the subject of water, I can confirm that the X3 is very waterproof. On a recent holiday to Mallorca, I spent a lot of time with the camera in the water, and despite lots of diving and jumping, I had no problems at all. But as I touched upon in the Me Mode section, without the dive case, the stitching doesn't work at all well underwater, and you get crazy effects like this hideous sea creature. What even is that? Oh, it's just me. That very nearly brings us to the end of my review of the Insta360 X3, but before I finish, just a couple of things that I found about the unit itself through using it, some good, some bad. First of all, the quick capture feature, something I've used a hell of a lot on the X2, is a little handicapped in this one in that you can't change the settings at all. Regardless of what mode you have the camera in during normal use, when you switch it off and then use the quick capture button, the one where you push the button and it turns on, starts recording on its own, it's always locked to 5.7K 30 frames per second. There's no way to change it. That's really annoying because the quick capture feature is something I've used a lot and I prefer to record in 25 frames per second. So it's kind of unusable for me now. Another very small issue that I've had a few times is that when I've closed the door, it's a bit difficult to get this bottom catch in. You have to really crud it home. Small thing, but it does happen. And also, before I realised this whole 30 frames per second thing, I used the quick capture feature a few times and it didn't recognise my memory card straight away. Obviously this didn't happen at all with the Insta360 memory cards, but when I used the 512GB Samsung one, had a bit of a problem sometimes. That seems to have gone away with the latest firmware update, so hopefully that's put to bed now. And the final thing that I've not been entirely happy with this camera is the increased feeling of fragility. This screen is absolutely massive. Yes, it is tempered glass, does seem to be quite tough, but I've just been constantly afraid of doing something silly and breaking it, especially when you consider that I've been strapping this onto a motorbike and hurtling it at great speed in an area where it's very likely it could get a stone chip or a particularly angry bug. Be nice to get some sort of screen protection available for this. And also, this isn't new, but the lenses themselves are sticking out in the wind quite a lot. They're very bulbous, they're just waiting to be scratched or dinged, and you have to be really careful to keep these things scratch free. Unfortunately, as it happens, on my last little outing today, for the last little bits of footage for this review, I managed to throw the camera on the floor and, you guessed it, I've scratched up the lenses. So although they may affect the quality of the visuals a little bit, if you're going to get yourself one of these cameras, I do recommend getting yourself some kind of lens protection because it's probably going to end up on the floor, and don't end up like me where you've got a camera with scratched lenses and there's nothing you can do about it. Otherwise, been really impressed with the X3, some nice upgrades from its older brother the X2. In particular, this big screen is an absolute pleasure to use. Don't have to worry about using the app anymore to frame your shots and change your settings and things. This thing is brilliant. The slightly larger sensor, slightly larger lenses means slightly better lower light performance, and also upgrades in terms of frame rates and resolutions. It's nice to see. Slightly longer battery life, and the door instead of that flappy thing that was on the old camera is a big plus. If I'm honest, I had hoped that the next camera in the family was going to be slightly smaller than the X2, and I had also hoped that we were finally going to take the bump up to 8K resolution for the 360 footage. But it seems like sadly we're going to have to wait for a future camera to get those features. But with those things aside, this is a great step forward for Insta360, and if this is going to be your first foray into 360 cameras, you could go far worse than getting yourself an Insta360 X3. If you've already got an X2 and you're considering whether there are enough new things there for you to upgrade, that's something you're really going to have to make up for yourself based on what you've seen. And that's that. Thank you so very much for watching my little review of the Insta360 X3. Thanks also to Insta360 for chucking me this camera over to test, and remember, though they gave me the camera, they didn't give me the opinions. If you found this video useful and interesting, please do give it a like. If you found it nonsensically numbing, then please do give it a dislike. Either way, give me a comment with any of your questions, queries and quarrels, and I'll do my very best to get back to you. I've been AndyManCam, this has been the Insta360 X3, and you are going to go and watch more of my videos.